I'm Sam. I'm not dramatic by habit. I run a small creative studio. I like my coffee strong, my tools organized, and my house exactly the amount of lived in I can afford to maintain. For years, that house was the thing I treated like a stubborn, beloved pet. Expensive, needy, and mine. It's where I paid bills until my eyes watered, where I got through a breakup on a folding couch, where I cultivated the kind of quiet routine that keeps a person afloat. What's at stake, bluntly, is the last stable foothold I had after a decade of doing everything right and still getting knocked off balance. So when my sister Lena showed up for Sunday dinner with her smile turned up to broadcast mode and my parents acting like they'd been briefed by a wedding planner, I knew something was about to go sideways. I didn't know how sideways. My parents, Helen and Frank, had cooked my favorite dish, roast chicken the way my grandmother did it, crispy skin, lemon under the breast. So naturally, I thought it was going to be a nostalgic catch-up. It doesn't register as an ambush when the table looks like a Hallmark set and gravy glistens under perfect lighting. That's the point. Ambushes come wrapped in roast chicken. Lena, who still moves through life with that soft, practiced hurt that works like a magnet in our family, announced, "Guess what? Mom and Dad helped me find somewhere to stay. I'll be moving into Sam's place next weekend." She said it like she was announcing a promotion. For context, Lena is 32, excellent at making needs sound like necessities. She'd been between jobs for a while with an impressive history of dramatic exits and brief re-entries into the family safety net. Our parents have been permissive. Not malicious, they think of themselves as helpful, but permissive in a way that always left me on the outside of their generosity. Lena qualified for comfort. I qualified for patience. My entire life had been the background track while their attention did somersaults for her. "Wait," I said, because that's what you do when someone puts a plan on your property without asking. "You're moving into my house?" "Yes," Lena chirped. "They fixed up the spare room and isn't it great? Temporary, of course, until I get back on my feet." Helen's face had that soft, satisfied glow people get when they've done a charity they can talk about for weeks. Frank nodded as if he'd signed something. No one put their phone down. Not because they were being subtle, because they were excited to see me spin. I felt something in my chest, thin, hot, indignant, that didn't belong to the dinner. Temporary has been the euphemism that funds everything in our family. Temporary becomes permanent the way smoke becomes a stain. I tried to speak before my mouth fogged with the kind of anger that makes people apologize for a decade. "You didn't ask me." Helen patted my hand like she was smoothing a napkin. "We told Lena, we thought." She searched for a softer shape to put apologies in, but found none. Frank tried a joke about saving me upkeep. The room leaned into the plan the way people lean into a tidy story. Lena smiled at me, the smile of someone who knows she'll get what she wants because the universe is a co-conspirator. Someone across the table clinked a glass as if toasting a victory. My neighbor's gardenias would have wilted in solidarity. I could have stayed calm. I could have listed contracts, explained boundaries, given them my calm, measured disappointment, and gone to bed angry. But this was my house. The thing about living with long-term, low-grade family enabling is that you build up a kind of patient savings account, and then, once in a great while, you spend it all on a single, glorious withdrawal. So I did something that now, in retrospect, I'm equal parts proud and mildly terrified of. I set my fork down. I looked at Lena like I was telling her a private joke that would sting. "Funny thing," I said. "You won't be moving in." There was a pause long enough for the gravy to congeal in the bowl. Lena's smile looked like a balloon someone had started to deflate. Helen's hand froze mid-reach for the bread. Frank blinked and then blinked again, the way a man does when the script flips. "I sold the house," I said. 3 words. An earthquake in placid family collusion. You could hear the utensils. You could hear the neighbor's dog in the next yard decide whether or not to bark. Lena's forehead creased. "Sold?" she echoed, voice fraying at the edges. "Sold," I repeated. "Closed last Friday. New owners are moving in. They have the keys." That's when the room did the thing families do when someone steps outside the narrative. It tried to rearrange itself to make sense of me. Lena laughed, nervous and high. "Was this?" she searched. "Were you trying to spite me?" It was the only story they had rehearsed. In our family's common tongue, the only acceptable explanation for a woman taking radical control of her life was that she'd been vindictive. No, I said, and the coolest thing happened. I told the truth. I did not explain why I'd sold it. I didn't get into roofs and pipes and the quiet math of survival. I simply said, it's sold. The looks that hit me were exactly the ones I'd been saving for a decade of small betrayals. Disbelief, anger, that particular blend of wounded pride and accusation that says, how dare you act like an adult without consulting us? Lena's jaw worked like she was chewing on the idea that I could, in fact, make choices that excluded her. Helen looked hurt in the way parents do when their intentions are thanked with a refusal. Frank looked like he'd been told a bad joke. You could have told us, he said. I did tell myself, I said. I wrapped my fingers around the stem of my wine glass and felt the vintage slide cool and indifferent through my bones. Somewhere, the roast chicken steamed. Somewhere. Normality rearranged itself. Silence is a kind of verdict. They had planned a move that assumed my compliance. I had given them a fact that proved I was no longer the hinge on which their decisions rotated. Lena stood abruptly, chair scraping, her face a mask that had no room for the small, steady truth I'd offered. Fine, she said, but there was something brittle under the word. Fine. They left that night with leftovers and the rumor they'd baked about my house still warm in their mouths. I cleaned the plates. I stacked the napkins. I felt both absurdly empty and strangely free, like a person who finally got out of a bad but familiar dream. It was a tidy, theatrical end to an ambush. It wasn't the last act. It was the reveal. The family plan had been shattered, not by yelling, not by pleading, but by a title deed and a couple of signatures. They had assumed their plans would fold into my life like paper into an envelope. Instead, my signature sealed the envelope closed. There was quiet afterward, the kind that has teeth. I slept on an empty bed in an empty house that now technically belonged to someone else in the world. I woke up with a weird, trembling clarity. I had taken an action that put my needs first, and the fallout would be either a storm or a cleansing rain. Either way, I was no longer merely the stage upon which everyone else's dramas performed. I was a participant, a decision maker, and the rest of the family would have to catch up. They drove by like they were on a mission. Texts, calls, cousins calling with that special family fervor that turns gossip into gospel. My inbox filled with the same questions in different costumes. Outrage, disappointment, pleading, the old, practiced hurt that reads like a script. How could you? You sold without telling us? That's so cold, Sam. My phone became a courtroom where everyone had already decided the verdict. Aunt Rita called first. Aunt Rita is the sort of woman who wears pearls when she tells you off. She's been my mother's loudest ally for 50 years. You sabotaged Lena, she said, voice polished with certainty. You did it to be spiteful. Cousin Marco, 27, habitually dramatic, who once turned a lost parking spot into a family legend, texted a gif of a mic drop. Uncle Steve left a voicemail that started with, "We raised you better than that," and ended in an existential sigh. It wasn't just shock. It was sanctimony wrapped in concern. Helen and Frank pivoted between hurt and accusation like they were trying to master a new dance. At family brunches now, I got the sympathetic sigh reserved for people who break the unspoken rules. You should have talked to us. Why would you do something so extreme? You sold without thinking about Lena. Someone, Cousin Mariah, always the mediator, suggested that I'd done it to ruin Lena's chances. She was going to get back on her feet here, she said. You ruined that for her. They spun a moral tale where my single act of agency could only be villainy. Everyone wanted the tidy narrative of the spiteful sibling. It fit better with how they wanted the world to work. I tried to answer with facts. I tried to explain, in the tone I use on invoices and friendly client emails, why the house wasn't a whimsical asset I could wave like a magic scarf. I'm not a reckless person. My studio pays the bills, usually, but in the last year, projects stalled, clients delayed payments, and the slow grind of small business life started to look like steady erosion. It began with the roof. I'd been patching it for years, the kind of I'll do it next spring patches that become permanent, ugly friendships with buckets and tarps. One heavy rain, an attic joist failed, and a leak opened into the guest room, the room Lena had earmarked as the spare. I climbed into the attic and found the insulation caked, the wood soft under my hands. A contractor's estimate said simple replacement, $14,200. I said the number out loud once, and the house seemed to sigh. Then a water line broke, a slow, traitorous crack under the slab, and water crept into my basement where I kept my workbench and client files. Mold spores dusted everything like bad confetti. Repair plus cleanup plus the cost of salvaging electronics, $4,800. I called people because I had to. I documented everything because I live by documentation. And finally, the heating system died in February, the kind of death that arranges itself on the coldest night and laughs while you sleep. The furnace guy said replacement or risk frozen pipes and a ruined winter. Another estimate, $7,600. If I told you I didn't do the math in my head, I'd be lying. I added the three numbers slowly like counting teeth. 4,200 plus 4,800 equals 19,000. 19,000 plus 7,600 equals 26,600. $26,600. That's not pocket change when you're juggling payroll, rent for studio space, and a mortgage that already eats more than half your income. When I told Lena and then Helen and Frank, they had a catalog of rebuttals already printed in their heads. "You could have asked us to help," Helen said, with the disappointed cadence of someone who believes guilt is a currency. "We would have helped." Frank's line was a little softer, but no less sharp. "We could have figured something out." I told them I had asked, quietly, privately, but that help had been folded into past favors. Loans that were never asked for back, babysitting that turned into monthly expectations. A pattern where Lena's needs were elastic, and mine were measured on a different scale. I said I had tried crowdfund-style solutions, negotiated payment plans, looked into insurance. I told them about the contractor who insisted that delaying the roof replaced would double the cost, about the plumber who warned a slow leak would ruin the slab if untreated, about the furnace tech who wouldn't guarantee a temporary fix. I told them I'd been carrying the decisions alone because I had to. They heard the words but not the context. In the family logic, sacrifice is noble, but only if it is performed in a way that keeps everyone's roles the same. If you step out of the role, if you make a practical choice that disrupts the system of favors and future obligations, you become the disruptor, the villain. They disapproved of my method more than my motive. Spite made a better story than necessity. Their anger turned social. Invitations slowed to a trickle. The group chat that had once been full of shared recipes and circulation of bad political memes grew skittish. Lena's messages were sharp and small. "I can't believe you did this to me." You didn't have to. She'd text then ghost, then text again at odd hours with sentences that evaporated before they could be grounded in conversation. Internally, I folded the numbers into the narrative of my life. I am not immune to shame. I felt a strange, stinging embarrassment that this most private of financial crises had become a family morality play. It's humbling to have your finance spreadsheet become someone else's gossip. I started to carry copies of the estimates in my bag like warding talismans. An attic estimate, a plumber's invoice, the furnace quote. Not because I wanted to flaunt them, but because I needed to be ready. People were assuming I'd sold out of malice. I felt the necessity of proof, even if it made me feel like I had to prove my own life. I also felt a different element, anger. This wasn't only about money. This was about a dynamic where I'd been expected to be the stable one while others were allowed to orbit chaos. It stung that my parents, who would talk endlessly about giving and family duty, had casually rehearsed a plan that treated my house like a prop. They had enabled Lena for years. They had accepted her short-term catastrophes as familial investments. When I finally took a step to stop that pattern, to make a decision that prioritized my survival over an endless cycle of rescues, it offended them more than the person they'd been rescuing. So they doubled down. They accused me of cruelty. They said I'd left Lena without options. They suggested, without quite coming out and saying it, that my action was punitive, that I'd let them pay the price to teach a lesson. It was easier to believe me evil than to face the reality that their pattern of enabling had consequences, and that maybe they'd been part of the problem. I didn't argue every time. I picked my moments. Mostly, I listened, because if you want people to see a different angle, you have to give them space to be wrong first. But the more they insisted that I'd acted from malice, the more I started to feel something else. The solid, boring conviction that comes from having actually done the work to stay afloat. I had not sold out of spite. I had sold because roofs rot, pipes fail, and furnaces stop, and because sometimes survival is a practical transaction, not a moral failing. They kept saying you could have asked. The truth I kept to myself then was that I had, and it hadn't been the kind of help that fixed structural problems. It had been emotional loans and promises that looked good in the moment and never materialized when contractors arrived with stamped estimates. So the family roared. I sat with the roar. I kept my receipts. I carried the reality like an inconvenient truth in my pocket. The fallout was loud and ugly. It was also clarifying. The accusations felt like knives, but they also cut the tidy fabric of old roles I'd been sewn into. They exposed how everyone had been practicing a certain kind of denial. By the end of it, I was exhausted and oddly unburdened. The shame felt smaller when it was real and explained, and the anger felt less like burning and more like fuel. They loved their version of the story. I had my own facts. If they wanted the melodrama of a spiteful sister, they could have it. But I knew the math, the quotes, the dates, the nights of sleeping with a space heater and a gratitude list. What I didn't know, and what simmered behind the anger and the paperwork, was whether my family would ever choose truth over story. That, I realized, was the next thing I had to test. After weeks of the same loop, group chat sermons, awkward brunches, Lena's half pleas, and full accusations, I realized I couldn't keep bandaging the family's narrative with private replies and clipped explanations. Facts need witnesses sometimes. So I called a meeting. Not a dramatic intervention with chairs in a circle and labeling emotions, just a practical thing. My parents' living room, a printed folder for each person, and two people who knew my finances better than anyone in the family. Jordan Patel is my financial advisor. He's 38, precise, and so boringly good with numbers that spreadsheets calm down when he opens them. Riley Chen is a colleague from the studio, smart, blunt when necessary, and someone Lena had met once at a holiday party and liked because Riley is unreasonably fond of nachos. I asked both to come because Jordan could speak to the math and consequences, and Riley could speak to reputation and what it looks like when someone is trying to keep a small business alive. I arrived with 3 ring binders. One had contractor bids, the attic roof replacement, the slab excavation estimate, the furnace replacement paperwork. One had invoices and correspondence, late invoices from clients, emails showing promised payments pushed back, my attempts to get help from insurance and lenders. The last had my closing documents for the sale. I didn't do this for theater. I did it because people had already decided the story, and the facts needed voices. Helen and Frank looked like 2 people who had been invited to a school play and were worried the lead might have forgotten her lines. Lena sat stiff, like someone who'd been handed a script she hadn't read. The living room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old lectures. Jordan started. He didn't look at me first. He looked at my parents like he needed them to see the numbers without the drama. "I manage Sam's accounts," he said. "I can show you the short version or the long one." The roof was an immediate structural issue. The slab leak is expensive and long-term damage if postponed. The furnace failure in winter would have risked frozen pipes and catastrophic damage. He spoke without flourish, then opened a spreadsheet on his tablet and handed copies around. I watched Helen's face tighten as she read an itemized list with those blunt dollar amounts. When she hit the line that said, "Projected escalation if delayed, 2x, 3x cost," she looked up like someone who'd been handed a mirror showing a face she hadn't expected. Frank's jaw loosened a millimeter. Lena's mouth opened and closed. You could see her trying to fit this into the story she already had. Riley didn't bother with spreadsheets. She told a story. "Sam runs a business," she said. You don't keep invoices in a shoebox and expect people to respect you. Sam balanced client relationships and deadlines under pressure for months. I've pulled projects out of trouble with Sam. She was making decisions, sometimes unpopular, to avoid collapse. She spoke about reputation and clients and what it looks like when a contractor tells you to replace a roof now, not 6 months from now. She talked about nights the studio stayed open because Sam refused to let a team suffer for avoidable reasons. It was small business life, translated into human terms. Then I handed out a printout of an email chain I'd tried to explain before, but no one had read. It showed contractors' warnings, my calls to insurance, my emails to the family where I'd asked for help with specific repairs and been met with vague promises or assumptions that someone would figure it out. I didn't include anything dramatic, no emotional appeals, just dates and requests. I did it because memory bends facts toward whatever feels best, and I wanted the facts to sit on the table. My parents were quiet for a long, terrible minute. Silence in that room finally did the work I'd been trying to force. The narrative that had been most convenient, that I'd acted out of malice, had to confront plain, dull paperwork. Helen's eyes filled with that slow parental grief that arrives when you realize you might have been part of the harm. "We thought we were helping Lena," she said, voice smaller. We didn't realize." "You thought," Jordan said gently, "that fixing a short-term housing problem would cost less than remediation. You didn't account for systemic enabling. Financial decisions have consequences even when intentions are good." Lena reacted like a person hit by a cold wave. "So you sold it? You didn't talk to me?" she asked, and there was real hurt there. She wasn't all performative anger. There was confusion, too. She had been planning to land somewhere she thought safe. That safety had been a family project, not a negotiation. Riley leaned forward. "Lena, this isn't an attack on you." Sam explained her position. Sam has been carrying structural expenses for months and making calls to keep a business and a house from collapsing. She tried to get help. The sale prevented more damage and provided a clean financial reset. I watched the shift as it happened, small, with the halting steps of a person learning a new language. Frank protested in an old, reflexive way. We should have been included. It wasn't a defense of Lena so much as a defense of the family script. The way they'd always fixed things by stepping in and keeping roles intact. Jordan answered that calmly. Inclusion works 2 ways. It's also including Sam in decisions that affect her life and property. You can't plan another adult's housing without their consent. That line seemed to hang and change a few things. Inclusion as mutual, not as a permission slip for entitlement. That had been the missing noun in all our conversations. It was as if someone had rearranged the grammar. There were moments of real friction. Lena accused me of being cold again. My parents cried with shame, anger, a strange blend of both. Cousin Mariah, who had been so quick to claim moral scapegoat status, sat with a quiet face and asked questions. "Did you really try to get help?" she asked me. When I showed the email threads, she sank back, uncomfortably aware she'd been cheering for a version of events she hadn't checked. Jordan said something technical that landed like a stone in water. Selling the asset was a rational decision to preserve equity. If Sam had ignored the repairs and the costs escalated, she could have faced liens, bankruptcy, or worse, tenants with claims if the house became unsafe. I advised sale as a less damaging option. He used the words preserve equity and liens and less damaging like tools, not accusations, and somehow that made the action less theatrical and more adult. At one point, Lena stood up and walked to the back of the couch where a picture frame sat with our grandmother's smile in it. She touched it like she was searching for permission in the past. "I always thought you were the safe person," she said quietly, not to hurt me, but to understand who I was in her life. "I didn't think you would do something like this." "You thought too small," I said, because sometimes the blunt answer is the only honest one. "You thought my life was available to patch. It wasn't." There was a fracture that evening, sure. Tears, apologies that still had edges. But something else happened that had not happened in months. My family began to listen in a different way. Not everyone, not perfectly, but the chorus of certainty that had punished me for days splintered when 2 outside voices corroborated my reality. When Jordan left, Frank escorted him to the door and asked practical questions about financial planning and protection. His tone no longer had the accusatory sharpness of someone who thought he'd been betrayed, but the worried cadence of someone starting to reckon with an unseen risk. Helen asked me later, quietly, whether she could help me look for a smaller place that fit my budget. It was tentative, imperfect, but it was a start. The validation from outside, from a financial professional and someone who watched me do the work, didn't magically make everything all right. It did, however, puncture the certainty that my motives were pure villainy. It turned my explanation from "she says so" into "here's the evidence, here are the consequences." Evidence pulled narratives toward facts in a way emotion alone never could. Lena didn't immediately apologize. She had a lot to process: loss of a plan, pride bruised, and the shock of discovering that her usual safety net had costs. But she stopped acting as if I'd declared open war on her life. For the first time in years, the conversation shifted from blame to consequence. That's not a small thing. By the time people left, there were still fumes and small, fragile compromises to make. Old patterns don't dissolve just because someone brings paperwork. But the family's story about me had a crack in it now, a real one. My parents could see where their enabling had a price. Lena could finally see the house not as a birthright, but as a piece of property with liabilities. I slept that night with a sense of strange relief. The meeting hadn't solved everything. It had simply brought the truth into a room where fiction had been the preferred language. And sometimes, especially in families, that's the first step toward actually changing the grammar. After the meeting, things didn't snap into perfect repair overnight. Families don't do neat. They do slow. They do awkward small steps and the occasional glorious misstep that looks like progress. But the current changed. Subtle, stubborn, and real. Lena surprised me first. A week after Jordan and Riley left, she showed up at the studio with a thermos of bad coffee and an apology that wasn't polished, which made it honest. "I'm sorry," she said, then added, "and also, can I be useful?" That was new vocabulary from her. Useful. She'd spent years practicing need. She hadn't practiced contribution. I could have offered sympathy and a couch. Instead, maybe out of practical habit or petty optimism, I offered her something more stable, a job. Not charity, an entry-level role with a clear pay rate, set hours, and one unforgiving condition: reliability. "We're short-handed," I told her. "You show up on time, you learn, and you'll get paid. We're not going to paper over problems, Lena. We're going to do actual work." She took it. Not willingly at first. She took it with that wobbly mix of pride and terror that comes with reclaiming responsibility. At the studio, she discovered rhythms she hadn't known she liked. The satisfaction of a deliverable finished, the small triumph of a client email answered professionally, the lack of quiet entitlement that had characterized her previous jobs around our family. For the first time in a long while, praise for her work felt earned, not handed down as a consolation prize. Work didn't magically fix everything. She still had to contend with old instincts, but it taught her a new muscle: accountability. Our parents watched. Helen, who used to swoop in with solutions like a superhero with trust issues, started asking fewer leading questions and more practical ones. "Do you need help with transport?" instead of "Why didn't you call me the second the roof leaked?" Frank began showing up at open studio nights not to save, but to ask how he could invest in Lena's training classes and then actually write a check. Their gestures were small, clumsy, human, but they were different. They no longer assumed Lena's needs were free of cost. There were conversations, too, that made everyone uncomfortable in the best possible way. Helen acknowledged, slowly and with a flinch, that the family had for too long mistaken rescue for parenting. Frank admitted that his reflex to fix had often meant he'd bypass the adult in the room. They didn't become flawless in a month, but they started to notice patterns instead of merely responding to them. Accountability, it turns out, is learnable. Painfully, iteratively learnable. Me? I moved. The townhouse I found was smaller but sensible. 2 bedrooms, a compact yard that didn't demand a landscaper's salary, and a kitchen with a light that finally hit the counter just right in the mornings. I sold what I needed to sell, paid down debts that had been gnawing like mice at a pantry, and set up a budget that had both line items and breathing room. For the first time in years, my monthly expenses didn't feel like a cliff edge I had to leap over with a prayer. Financial stability didn't arrive like a warm bath. It was incremental, a client who finally paid on time, a contract that didn't fall through at the last minute, the absence of surprise bills because I'd planned for repairs in advance instead of hoping they wouldn't happen. I replaced the metaphorical bandage with a plan, and the plan replaced panic with something steadier. I also made space for things I'd shelved for survival. I signed up for an evening pottery class because I was tired of thinking in invoices only. I planted succulents that asked for little and got a lot in return. On Saturdays, I rode a borrowed road bike down to the river and let myself be tired in a way that felt earned and quiet. There are pleasures in small, dignified routines, the kind that don't require salvage missions from parents or weekly rescue ops for siblings. Lena learned, too. She paid half of her first month's rent in the townhouse she'd been planning like it was owed to her. She occasionally called to ask for help that was specific and reasonable rather than vague and performative. And when she messed up, late to a shift or foggy about a deadline, she owned it and fixed it. Ownership changed her. It made apologies more useful and resentments less attractive. The family, oddly enough, found a new way to be together that didn't hinge on constant triage. Holidays were quieter and less dramatic. Birthday gifts became small and thoughtful rather than grand gestures meant to paper over an imbalance. When Lena flourished in a way that didn't revolve around our parents' intervention, they learned to celebrate without the compulsive urge to step back into caretaker mode. It was clumsy, imperfect progress, like teaching someone to ride a bike by holding the seat lower until they realize their balance. As for Lena and me, we are not a sitcom where wounds vanish by Act 3. There are still sharp sentences, and some nights I remember the ambush dinners and feel my old indignation flare. But there's also a newness. We talk about money without theatrics. We plan without entitlement. And the word house no longer implies automatic access. She texts me now with mundane updates. A successful shift. A recipe she tried. A joke about office coffee. Those texts are tiny, but they're real. The moral, if I am forced to name it, and I would prefer not to be forced because that's not how life works, is that love without accountability can become a kind of cruelty. Saving someone from consequences often preserves the problem rather than solves it. My family learned slowly that generosity is better when it has structure, and that stability for one person doesn't have to be the erasure of another's hard-won boundaries. One afternoon, months later, Helen came by the townhouse with lemon bars and an awkward apology that was actually completely earned. "We were wrong to assume," she said, sitting on my small couch like she was learning how to occupy space differently. "We thought we were helping. We didn't see how we were hurting." She meant it. That mattered more than any dramatized apology. There's a quiet, almost ridiculous pleasure in normalcy now. A mailbox that reliably gets my bills, a studio day that ends with a project uploaded and paid, a sister who shows up on time, and a family that asks before assuming. The new owners of the old house live their life there. I pass it sometimes on dog walks and feel neither grief nor triumph, only a neat, practical satisfaction. It's where my past obligations ended and my choices began. I didn't win some cinematic revenge. I didn't burn bridges in a blaze of righteous fury. My payoff was smaller and, in the long run, better. I reclaimed my autonomy. The family learned to see a ledger as part of a love story, and Lena found dignity in the steady work herself. We all got smarter about what help actually looks like. If this sounds unsentimental, it is, because I like my endings tidy but realistic. My revenge, if you want to call it that, wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about refusing to be the safety net without seams. It was about turning enabling into accountability, rescues into resources, and a lifetime of temporary into something we all had to earn. In the end, the house I sold bought me something I hadn't realized I needed: space to be an adult, and the small, stubborn pleasure of watching my family learn to be better adults too.